Hello everybody, welcome back once again to another episode of Spliced In Later. I hope you all are keeping well out there in the digital world. Today, just a normal episode this week, as I don't have any movies to review for you this week. Despite what I said last week that, maybe I'll watch that Guy Ritchie movie, The Covenant, and review that. Can't. Because, the Hot Ones with Jake Gyllenhaal did not advise me when they were telling me this movie existed that it was only being released in theaters in certain places in America, and it will be on Amazon apparently, just not yet. So you'll have to wait a bit, but with Peter Pan and Wendy coming out at the end of the week and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 out next week, we got some movie reviews coming for you in the future, so be sure to stick around for that. But I did also allude last week that if I couldn't talk about The Covenant, that I would talk about this particular thing if the last episode that I was watching stuck the landing and gave me the satisfaction of a perfect season. And I'm very happy to say that it did, which makes it all the more incredulous and a need that I have to talk about it when you consider that the other seasons on this show were absolute garbage. We are talking today about Star Trek Picard as a whole, the show, but I really want to focus more on the most recent season that came out, Season 3. Now, I haven't addressed Star Trek much on this show. None of the movies came out while I was running this podcast. And I haven't wanted to talk about any of the new Star Trek that has been coming out over the last few years. New Trek is not really my jam. When I say New Trek, I don't mean the Chris Pine movies. I actually quite enjoy them, and I think they're great, and I think they need a bit more love than they actually get. I'm thinking specifically more what started out on CBS All Access, but is now on Paramount Plus, which is the new TV shows that have been coming out, specifically Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard. They have not been satisfactory for me when it comes to what I'm looking for in a Star Trek show, which is why these days, most of the time, if I want that, I've been watching The Orville instead with Seth MacFarlane, which is crazy that a show made by Seth MacFarlane, the guy from Family Guy, who basically, you can tell in the beginning, he just wanted to make a show, like a Star Trek show that he was the star of, and that morphed into a really fantastic, incredulously entertaining show to a point where The Orville is better Star Trek than the Star Trek that was currently airing during that time. I have done a whole episode on The Orville, so if you haven't heard that and you're intrigued, go back and check that out. I'm pretty sure I talked for ages about how good it was, which is the vibe for most of my episodes, with just talking a lot incoherently, but hopefully the message gets across. This may start a series where I do talk about the different Star Trek shows. As a whole, the classic Star Trek stuff I really, really, really like. And there was a time I liked Star Wars more than Star Trek. I don't feel like you have to like one or the other. There's this belief, which I don't think is very big, but there's always been sort of aching in the background there that either you like Star Wars or you like Star Trek, and the fans of either one vary against the other. I don't think that's actually true. I think that's just what is made up on the TV for people who don't watch either show to just be like, what is this stuff that people are talking about? There may be some animosity, but I've never really come across it. I like both, and they're both two very different products. You can't really compare one with the other. Star Wars is a fantasy show set in a world that does not exist in ours. Star Trek is a potential future envisioned by a very optimistic person about where Earth could end up during space travel. So one or the other doesn't really matter. But I did prefer Star Wars over Star Trek for a long time. Recently, with the way Star Wars went and some of the choices that were made, I tended to then lean towards more Star Trek, but then Star Trek's also had some pretty rough new stuff recently. So it's really just whatever I'm in the mood for. But I tend to, when I'm in the mood for Star Trek, I'm in for all the Star Trek. The original series, Next Generation, all of that stuff. And it's very well made shows. A bit cheesy, especially the stuff in the 60s, and even the stuff that aired from 1987 probably through to about 2004. That uninterrupted run of Star Trek shows is a bit dated, and you can see like the plastic and the boom mics in certain things, but it's still quality storytelling, which I've really loved about Star Trek. So we may go back and we may go and talk about all of those shows distinctively. Original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise. But we'll see how we go. We see how I feel after I talk about this particular Star Trek Picard. I do have to give you a little bit of background if you've listened to this episode and you've never seen any Star Trek and you don't know what Star Trek Picard is or why it exists or what the big deal about it is, if it's good or bad. So basically, a real brief rundown of what Star Trek is. It was a show created in the 60s by a guy named Gene Roddenberry. Gene Roddenberry, bless his heart, had a very optimistic view of space and the future of humanity, as I mentioned earlier. Clearly, it was needed. Coming out of like 2 world wars, the Vietnam War, the Cold War was probably going on. Tensions between countries, racial tension, all of that shit. Roddenberry's idea of Star Trek was in the far, 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 far future where the human race has gone off into space, met all these different aliens from all these different planets, and the human race has abolished racism, crime, hatred, greed, all of that stuff. It's a perfect society that exists to explore, to make new friends, to bring peace and love and law and order and all of that shit to a lawless galaxy as it is. They've even the head of a federation that's been formed with all these different planets, which all work together in harmony. All those planets in the Federation. The Federation itself has its own military thing, kind of like the Navy for space. It's called Starfleet. All these different ships, they fly out into space, and the main goal of the ships is exploration. So for Star Trek, the original series, we followed William Shatner, who played Captain Kirk, alongside his Vulcan, emotionless first officer, Mr. Spock, the grumpy old medical doctor, Bones, and a cast of minor characters who really didn't get that much character development to really go into much detail about who they were. But they basically just ventured off into space. And space was like the Wild West. It's also been compared to like being on a horror show. Most episodes would be a nightmare scenario where they would go to a planet, beam down. Oh hell, this person is a insane, omnipresent being which wants to play with us as toy soldiers. This one's peered through a telescope and saw Nazis and went, that's the perfect way to run a planet, so turned their whole society into fascism. Time travel, gods, all these different things, and they'd have to work together to get out and escape to go on another adventure somewhere else. Kirk was the action hero captain, and Spock was his logical brains. That's basically it. Yes, it's very dated, it's very cheesy. As optimistic as Gene Roddenberry was about the future, you can argue that his view on sexism was still fully bad. The way he portrays women on that show, for instance, there's an episode where Captain Kirk's body is taken over by a mad female scientist, but that's okay. She can't run the Enterprise anyway because she's a woman, so she just collapses under the pressure and her mind goes crazy. And the less said about the miniskirts that the girls had to wear on the Enterprise, which was the name of the Star Trek ship, the less said the better. Only lasted for about 3 seasons. Then it was cancelled due to low ratings. I believe what saved the show was reruns. There was a lot of diehard fans for the Star Trek show that lobbied for it to come back. Reruns for the show, ratings were good. They made a little animated series, which apparently was very well received. If you ever do watch that, that's very dated, but quaint in its way. It's kind of like, if you step back and go, yes, animation sucked in the 70s, then it's okay. So it came back with some feature-length movies, which the first one's pretty boring, but from 2 onwards, with the exciting Wrath of Khan, there was a resurgence, a re-love for Star Trek. So a spin-off is created. The most important thing is the Next Generation comes out of Star Trek. That's the show that really launched the Star Trek of the night, of probably the Star Trek that most people growing up around my time was familiar with. On that show, it was another Enterprise about, 100 years after Kirk. I can't really remember. But that ship was captained by Patrick Stewart as Captain Jean-Luc Picard. The complete opposite of Kirk. Picard was a very upper-class plate emotions very close to the chest, follows the rules, gets things done, no-nonsense captain. His first officer, Commander Riker, was like the Kirk of the show. He was the action hero. He's the one that would go down to the planets and kiss all the ladies and go on adventures. And then the crew was made up of a bunch of different characters that were fleshed out immensely over 7 seasons. Whether you had the chief engineer, Geordie LaForge, who'd been born blind at birth, so he had a visor so he could see. The medical doctor, Beverly Crusher, who had some sort of romantic past with Picard, and her annoying son, Wesley, who was a genius. The ship's counselor, Deanna Troi, who was from a planet where people could read emotions. Very handy if you're a counselor. And then probably the two best characters, you had Worf, who was a Klingon, a warrior race that had been enemies of the Federation in the original series. In this instance, he's one of the only Klingons to serve in the Federation, and his ideology and way of thinking clashes a lot with how everybody else operates. And Mr. Data, played by Brent Spiner, who was an android, who spent the whole show trying to be more human, to learn how to emote, how to feel emotions, how to be more like his friends around him. The show got off to a very rocky start, a bit of a mess in the beginning, couldn't decide if it wanted to just do the original Star Trek again or was going to do its own thing. It managed to steer things up by the 3rd season, culminating in probably one of the best two-parter episodes, not just in Star Trek, but in just general TV history, the best of both worlds. A really intense two-parter that introduced an infamous Star Trek enemy, the Borg, which were these assimilating robot creatures. Well, not really robots, but robotic style, basically this organism that called the Borg Queen that assimilates people into her collective, turns them into mindless drones. In that two-parter, she managed to get hold of Picard, turned him into a Borg, and left everybody with an ominous cliffhanger where Picard was coming after the Enterprise and Riker was forced to fire on his own captain. Very, very iconic two-parter and episode of television in American history, easily. Next Generation's popularity got so good it got its own movies, and that of course spun off into all the other shows, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and then culminating in Enterprise, which ran for 4 seasons and finished in 2004, I believe. Then for a long time, Star Trek lay... Well, not a long time. For a few years, Star Trek lay dormant until it came back with the J.J. Abrams movie starring Chris Pine, which were more based towards the audience of my time, who were looking for more action and humor and excitement. Because what made Star Trek so good, and why a lot of Trekkies really, really love it, is it wasn't focused on being an action show. It wasn't focused on dazzling people with spectacle. Most episodes were just about solving philosophical questions, conundrums. What is the right thing to do in a certain situation? What is wrong? It tackled all sort of issues like that we're still trying to fucking figure out today, like the idea of gender and what it means to have a gender, racism, upper class ideology, eat the rich, all of that stuff was all in there. It was all about exploring, going out and seeing what the galaxy has to offer. And ideally, the ideology, hope, is that there's so much to see and learn and become better people as a result. That, I guess the people behind Star Trek in today's times are like, that's not going to sell. It's kind of there in the movies, but they're generally more action stuff. And then when Discovery came around in 2017, it's Star Trek in name, but it's not focused on being what Star Trek was, and is trying to somehow be both Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica at the same time, I think, which is all about villains, less self-contained episode stories, and more continuous story arcs that you have to watch episode after episode. The difference between old Trek and new Trek is you can't pick an episode of Discovery and just watch it and know exactly what's going on. You have to be like, who's that? When did that happen? What is that in reference to? Next Gen original series, you can pick something out of there. Easy peasy. There's that love for the Next Generation, and I think when Discovery was failing and people were going after the Orville, the powers behind Star Trek, who are they? Like Alex Kurtzman and Robert Orsi, whoever they are, were like, okay, people love the Next Generation. They want the Star Trek that they remember, characters anyway. So let's do a show about Captain Picard. Let's bring back Patrick Stewart as Jean-Luc Picard, and let's do a show set after he's captained the Enterprise and he's an old man living on his vineyard. Let's dissect the character. Let's figure out who he is, what makes him tick, all of that stuff. The show sounds good on paper, but what we got in the beginning was utter garbage. I'll break it down into 3 specific things. 1, the people writing for Star Trek Picard didn't actually want to do what I believe the show was initially created for, which was analyze the character of Picard. Instead, they wanted to turn him into an action hero and then analyze who they decided Picard should be based on what they've heard rather than what they've seen from Star Trek. And Patrick Stewart's probably a little bit to blame here as well. I love the guy. I think he's a fantastic actor and a fantastic human being. I love him in a lot of things I've seen. But I do believe he has a bit of an ego, and I don't think he understands what made Picard such a good character in The Next Generation. I think he looks back at Picard and sees Captain Kirk or something like that. So the Picard that we are watching in those first 2 seasons of Picard is not the Picard that we know and love. It's not even, you can't even argue that he's different because time has passed and he's grown into this. It's just a completely different character. His wants, his desires, his needs. He's overly emotional. He says ridiculous things. It's very strange. Number 2, as I said with Discovery, Picard is focused on season-long story arcs with very convoluted writing that doesn't make sense unless you are actively paying attention to every episode and you're retaining the information in every episode. I've always found with the first 2 seasons of Star Trek Picard, I've hated them as they've been premiering on a weekly basis on Paramount Plus because I don't know what's happening. I'm having trouble following along with all the different story beats and characters and things that are going all over the place. And by the end, I'm kind of just wishing for it to be over. But, and because I'm stupid, I buy these shows on DVD even though I hate them because I have all the other Star Trek, so I need them for my collection. And then often I've rewatched those seasons in like a continuous sitting, so I'm able to retain the information, so I'm able to enjoy them a little bit more. A little bit. My problems still remain. With the third point being that the writing is just, in my opinion, stupid. It's full of ridiculous lines and odd quotes which are designed to be put in trailers or to be quoted afterwards. So there'll be times when Picard just rambles on about the stars and he's like, who are you talking to and why? And the stories that they're telling, 1, they're not Star Trek, and 2, they're poorly written. The first season of Star Trek Picard starts out alright. It's Picard on his vineyard, old and alone. And then it evolves into the long-lost daughter of Data running into him. And then he has to go and get a crew of drug addicts and pirates to go somewhere. I'm struggling to remember what actually happened. And it all culminated in a giant portal in the sky with tentacles coming out to destroy the Earth, to destroy the galaxy. What? I don't know what's happening there. And then number 2, season 2 was a little bit better. The concept of Picard running into the Borg, but then before they destroy him, he's accidentally somehow thrown into a dystopian alternate reality where the Federation are like fascists. So he has to go back in time to find out what turned the Federation into fascists. His old frenemy Q is there along for the ride. The concept is a little bit more Star Trek-y, but it falls up to pieces because you've got to stretch this story out over 10 episodes. And the people writing it have this ridiculous idea, and I've got them on a quote saying it on some stupid show on YouTube, that sci-fi is only interesting if you write about what is affecting you today. So it's full of on-the-nose climate change, Donald Trump stuff, things which are relevant and are important, and we do need to fix that shit. But Star Trek is like an escapist show. Star Trek was designed, especially in the 60s, to be something you could watch and feel better and just either distract yourself for 40 minutes or make you optimistic about what the potential for humanity can be if we work together. But in these Picard shows, they're showing that, oh no, even in the 31st century, we're still burning the ozone layer. We're still being racist to people who are different to us. We're still electing people to power who are absolutely the worst, and they're supported by leftist, rightist, fascist, whatever people all over social media screaming and yelling at each other. That's not what I want from my Star Trek show. I want him to get in a spaceship and go to a planet and go, wow, that's cool. So yeah, those first 2 Star Trek Picard seasons, garbage. Hated it. It was one of the driving factors for me also going, the Orville's better. I will never really ever like any of the new Star Trek. Happily, I can report that things have started to turn around. There's a show that's come out called Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which feels much more Star Trek. I'm enjoying that a lot more. It's set before the original series. You got like a young Spock and a Captain Pike who was captain before Kirk. There's like an animated Star Trek Lower Decks show, which is a bit like a Rick and Morty style thing, which is just fun. It's a bit silly, and I didn't really want to give it a chance originally, but there's still the essence of Star Trek is still in there, which is nice. But the reason behind this whole episode today was because Star Trek Picard finished. So they decided after season 2 they were just going to do one last season. Despite what Facebook and the quotes on the DVD covers will tell you about it being the greatest show of all time, no one liked it. It did not get good reviews from what I could see. People were not tuning in. So they decided to can it. They probably pulled the budget for it for a bit. But in order to get people to watch that last season, at least that's what I thought originally, they announced that the whole original cast from The Next Generation, besides Patrick Stewart, were coming back. Jonathan Frakes, LeVar Burton, Michael Dorn, Gates McFadden, Marina Sirtis, and Brent Spiner. The whole crew. I thought it was a ploy. I was like, okay, yeah, sure. They'll bring back all those characters and just ruin them like they ruined Picard. What I apparently didn't know was that behind the scenes, things were changing too. Those showrunners that made the old Picard stuff trash, got rid of them. They got a new guy, Telly Metalis. I think it's Terry. So a bit depressingly, and with a sense of like this was my job, I tuned in to watch the first episode of Star Trek Picard season 3. And it started out with Dr. Crusher. She's off on a spaceship somewhere. She's got this unknown guy with him, and she's hiding from something, and she reaches out to Picard for help. He goes and gets Riker. They get a ship, captained by the biggest asshole, but the asshole that you love more than anything in the world, Captain Shaw, played by Todd Stashwick. 7 of 9's on the ship, and they go off to see what's going on with Dr. Crusher. By the end of that whole episode, you find out, hey, that man that she's with, that's Captain Picard's son that he never knew he had. Surprisingly solid start to the season, and I can happily admit that it only got better from there. I can't explain it. It's very strange to me that Star Trek Picard finished and I'm actively like, oh, I wish there were more. It's strange. You'd asked me a year ago if I wanted any more Star Trek Picard, I would have said, shut your mouth, leave me alone. What I can only put it down to why this season was so much better is the new showrunner, who clearly came up with the story and the way all the characters were integrated into the plot. They all weren't just shoved into the first episode straight away. You had Riker and Dr. Crusher in that first episode, and then very slowly everybody else was brought in. You had Worf come in. Geordi and Data don't show up till like episode 7, which is more than halfway through the season. But they all feel like natural extensions of themselves. Even Picard is written better. He sounds and acts and looks like what Picard would be at that age, how he would naturally progress from the Picard that we knew from The Next Generation. And the chemistry between all the original cast is still just as solid as ever. Whenever they were on screen together, you enjoyed it. You loved it. You enjoyed them bantering back and forth. They hadn't missed a beat. The story as well was interesting, engaging. The convoluted writing where you had 5 or 6 different plot things going on that all didn't make any sense and went nowhere, gone. You had a very specific story point that was following a linear path. They brought in other little bits here and there to complement the story, but the overall arc was not convoluted and was generally engaging and had satisfactory payoffs. The first 4 episodes is like a mini movie, and it's entertaining enough without then adding on the extra stuff at the end. It got to a point where I was actively looking forward to next week's episode. I was like, I'm right, it's Star Trek Picard. I would save it to be the last thing I would watch on a Thursday. On Thursday, I got a whole bunch of stuff coming out. You got all the Chicago shows. The Flash comes out on that day. I'm watching the Grease Rise of the Pink Ladies show, which is also pretty good. You should check that out. Titans is coming out again. A bunch of either really good stuff or mediocre stuff. But putting it all aside, Picard would be the very last thing I would watch so I could end the night on a high. And each episode, as the credits would end at the end, I was just like, now I got to wait a whole week to the next one. That's insane. Season 2 of Picard, I was like, is it time for Star Trek Picard already? God, how long's this one? 52 minutes? This go around, I was like, this episode's only 52 minutes? Oh no, I hope they have enough time to tell good story. Then I'm excited to watch it. By the end of the season, all the cast have come together. They're back together, flying in a ship. It feels like we never left them, standing up against the big bad of the final season, which in this instance, I'm not annoyed about because it was built to satisfactorily. And then it all culminates in a satisfactory ending, where if we never see these guys again, and who knows, we may, because the sudden love for this season means we may even get a whole other spin-off for this show if the fans have their way. But if this is the last time we ever see them again, sitting around a poker table and laughing away, I'll be so happy. I only wanted to make this episode just to address that Star Trek Picard Season 3 was good, because I know a lot of people that actively refuse to watch this season because the first 2 were so bad. And I'm with you. But think of this like a reverse Game of Thrones. Imagine if seasons 7 and 8 of Game of Thrones were the first season. They came out first. And people were like, blech, no thank you. I don't like that. But then season 4 came out with head popping and battles on the wall and poison purple weddings and stuff. And you went around telling people, you got to watch Game of Thrones now, it's good. And people don't believe you. This is what's happened with Star Trek Picard here, I think. Even going on social media, I can see people trashing the show just because they haven't watched season 3. They just know the first 2 were bad. So it's just fun to trash it now. But I implore the people who are listening to this, if you watched those first 2 seasons of Star Trek Picard and you hated them, I understand. I hated them with you. But this season, season 3 of Star Trek Picard, is one of the best seasons of a show I have seen in quite some time. And it is some of the best Star Trek that I have seen in quite some time. If you are missing the Next Generation crew and their stories, this season will satisfy you to no end. It's insane. It's crazy. It's very small instances where shows can be so bad and then so good without like a build-up. Like it's just snap. Somebody else took the wheel of this bus that was careening out of control down a mountain and managed to steer it to safety and drive us to Hawaii, where we're all drinking cocktails. It's the only way I can describe. There's other ways I could describe it, but you get what I'm saying. Basically, I give Star Trek Picard as a whole a 6 out of 10, because those first 2 seasons exist and they're attached to this thing, unfortunately. But season 3 as a whole, it's built in a way that you never have to watch those first 2 seasons. So rating Star Trek Season 3 specifically on its own, 10 out of 10. Fantastic stuff. Love it. It's reinvigorated my love for Star Trek, and I'm about to, as we speak, go back and rewatch the old stuff because of that. There we are. I hope that. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. If I can convince even one person listening to this who gave up on Star Trek Picard and isn't bothering with this season to give it a go, mission accomplished. I'll be back next week, I believe, to review Peter Pan and Wendy on Disney+. I don't think I'll review it as soon as it comes out because I don't think I have the time. But that means there'll probably be 2 episodes back to back next week. You're going to get a Peter Pan and Wendy review, and then you get a Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 review. I expect one review to be really, 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 really good. Can you guess which one that would be? Probably can. That's right. Peter Pan and Wendy. Haha. Jokes that I tell. All right, that's it. We'll wrap it up. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed. Watch Star Trek Picard Season 3. It is utterly glorious. I loved it so much, and I'm glad that I get to share my love with you all. Until next week for our movie reviews, you've been spliced in later. Adios, muchachos. I'll catch you next time.